So we've been studying work and work life for a very long time. And especially over the last 4 years or so with COVID, we started really looking at how the workplace is changing. And one of the things that we found is that about half of US workers say that they're highly satisfied with their job. Most US workers said that they were extremely or very satisfied with their relationship with their boss and their relationship with their coworkers. But when it comes to some other important aspects of work, like their pay, their opportunities of promotion, there's high levels of dissatisfaction. And only about a third of US workers say that they were highly satisfied with how much they're paid and with their opportunities for promotion. And it's really on the more practical side and on the more what pays the bills. People aren't really that happy with that.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. Let's be honest. Most of us use statistics published by research foundations to get our way, to get funding for a project, sell something, pitch a book, or win an argument. But how many of us actually take the time to understand how the data was collected, or whether or not the source was biased or unbiased, or look beyond whatever makes our point to understand the whole story? Today, we're joined by the Pew Research Center Associate Director of Research, Juliana Horowitz. Pew is a nonpartisan research institution dedicated to providing the public with objective information about the issues, attitudes, and trends that shape the world. For the last decade and a half, Juliana has been designing and managing domestic and international survey projects at Pew, covering a wide range of social issues, including race and gender equality, the changing American family, economic well-being, and of course, for the purposes of our show, attitudes about employment and work. Juliana is involved in all stages of the research process, including topic selection, the design of major survey initiatives, and data analysis and reporting. In this episode, Juliana and I discuss the research behind how Americans view their jobs, what we know about why people really quit during the Great Resignation, and how the pandemic reshaped work in the U.S. We also talk about the mission of the Pew Research Center, how Pew picks topics, the research methods, how talking heads and politicians sometimes spin the data for their own ends, and the right way to both hear and use such research, as well as other topics. Okay, as always, don't forget to support Work for Humans by subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. And now, I present my conversation with Juliana Horowitz. Juliana Horowitz, welcome to Work for Humans.
Thanks for having me.
So you're from the Pew Research Center, and people like me, talking heads, business leaders, we use survey data from organizations like Pew, and we use it to make a point. And it's almost like an incantation. It's like something where you have to begin each article by saying something like, according to Gallup, 40% of employees are miserable. And we always cherry pick the worst possible way that we can say it because we're afraid that we're not going to get people's attention if we can't do it. And certainly that's true for publishers. And I am totally guilty of it. I'm doing it right now. I'm writing an article for a major journal, and it's almost required. I've never been comfortable with it. And I will say, I don't think most of us have really looked at the research. And I think most of us are just quoting each other. So I want to fix that today. And I want to talk to you about how you do your research. I want to understand how you want us to use your research. Some of my questions are going to be about the findings, but a lot of them are going to be methodological. So to start off with, what is the mission of the Pew Research Center?
I'm very excited to talk about this because I do often talk about the research, but I think it is really important to talk about what's behind the research and why we do what we do. So the Pew Research Center is a nonpartisan, non-advocacy research organization based in Washington, D.C. And our mission is to generate a foundation of facts to help decision makers, help the public, to really just help our audiences better understand the world through a nonpartisan, non-advocacy lens, which is so rare these days. So much of the information that we consume is coming from people who have a dog in the fight, who have some sort of agenda or position or something that they're trying to convince people of. And it doesn't mean that those aren't valid missions and that those aren't important. But more and more in this polarized world, we feel that it's really important to have data-driven, rigorous research to really help drive conversations and decision-making and help us understand the world better. And so that's really what's behind the mission of the Pew Research Center, is really to close knowledge gaps and to shed light on how the country's changing. Actually, not just the country, we do international research too. So really how the world is changing and how people are responding to those changes.
Yeah, and preparing for this, I looked at all the other institutions that are doing research into how the population is feeling or sentiment analysis, things like that. And a lot of them have a dog in the fight. A lot of them are coming from an angle to support a particular point. And so it's really refreshing that there's a source out there that's gathering data without an agenda. What's your area of focus?
So my area of focus is social and demographic trends, which is a pretty big umbrella. Pretty much anything related to how the country's changing could fit under a social trend. But more recently, we have been focusing particularly on how the family and the workplace have been changing, both in terms of looking at demographic data, economic data, and the more sort of descriptive of how the country's changing. But then through our surveys, we're looking at how those changes are playing out in people's lives and how either through public opinion and how they feel about these changes in terms of their attitudes, but also in their personal experiences, how they're experiencing these changes. And so my team often combines secondary data, analysis of government data with the original research, which is my area of expertise, to really tell a broader, more comprehensive picture of these changes and how they're affecting people's lives.
And you've been doing this for how long?
So I'm coming up 18 years at the Pew Research Center. So I came to Pew straight out of graduate school when I decided I didn't want to be an academic, and came to Pew very excited, but didn't necessarily know that that's where I'd be. For people who were born when I started at Pew are now voting and are legal adults. So it's a long time.
Part of the reason I ask is because you got to go through all of COVID. And I have to ask, for somebody doing the kind of work that you do, was it kind of a thrill? Because the whole world was essentially rung like a bell, and you could see effects. For all of us, it was not a good time, but was it also really interesting?
I mean, it was really interesting. It was challenging in so many ways. So we were executing our FY20 agenda and starting to get ready for FY21 research agenda, which was set to start in the middle of 2020. So we had research projects that we were lined up to do, and all of a sudden the whole world changed. And we had to adapt to that, both in terms of how we were working, right? Because we were also living through this. We never worked remotely before. We were very much in the office 5 days a week organization prior to the pandemic. And we had to adapt to full-time remote work like everybody else. And we were also juggling things in our personal lives, whether it was children whose schools had closed or aging parents or whatever it was. We were scared just like everybody else and didn't know what was happening like everybody else. But at the same time, it was our mission to also try to make sense of it for everybody. And so we had to very quickly reorganize ourselves around not just our team, but really across the Pew Research Center to figure out how are we going to explain this to people? How are we going to help people make sense of how things are changing, how our lives are changing? And so we had to very quickly rethink our research agenda. And also, we've always been collaborative. We've always worked with our colleagues from other research teams. But in this case, COVID touched on everything. So we had a team that studies internet and technology. And so as we're studying how COVID is changing the workplace or how families are dealing with remote learning, technology was central to that. And so we have to work with our colleagues in the internet and tech group, or we have colleagues who study politics, and everything was so polarized from masking to vaccines. So not only were we trying to restructure our research agenda, figure out what we needed to learn about how the world was changing, but also work more collaboratively and also be working from home in a way that we had never done before, and working really fast because things were changing so quickly that often we get data back from a research project and we have several weeks, sometimes more than a month, to really look at the data, really think about what the analysis is showing, draft our reports, go through a whole process. And here we were turning things around so quickly because by the time we're in the field again with the next survey, there were new questions and new issues that we needed to address. And so In a way, I think it was very helpful to have that outlet and to feel like we were in real time understanding what was happening and understanding how it was affecting families. And it was an exciting time from that perspective. It was a stressful time from that perspective as well. But I think we did a good job of providing some context for people at a time where everything was so uncertain.
Yeah, and you had a real thing to do. You had a real thing to do for the country right then. That's got to feel good. How do you pick your topics?
We're very fortunate. I have to say, we're very fortunate because most of our funding comes from the Pew Charitable Trust, which is our parent organization. And so we have so much flexibility because we're not working with clients and we're not working with funders who tell us what to do. Every year, we go through a very exciting process of brainstorming and really thinking about both internally within our team, but then also collaboratively across the Pew Research Center and by engaging with others outside the center as well. Just thinking about within each of our research areas, what are the important topics that people are talking about in the country? What are areas where there are knowledge gaps that we can help fill? What are areas where the conversation has become so polarized, where facts are in dispute? And so we think about all of those things and think about where can we make a contribution to a national conversation and really bring facts and bring rigorous research and partial research into all these different debates and really help explain changes to people and help them see themselves in the data, but also see others that aren't like them in the data and maybe learn something about people who are experiencing life differently. So that's the process we go through. We involve both the research side and the communication side and work with our comms colleagues to think about what are the types of questions they're getting from our audiences that maybe we don't have data on and should be doing more on. And it's a very exciting time, usually around October, November. We're starting to think about the following fiscal year. And it's just this time of a lot of intellectual curiosity and really trying to think ahead to what the important questions will be in the following fiscal year.
Although a lot of them, because you trend them, you must have made decisions about a decade ago.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because we do have things that we do a study on one topic, and sometimes we know that we're going to keep asking questions about that one topic, and sometimes we don't. And sometimes we just come back to it maybe 2 years later, and then maybe 2 years after that. There are things that we know going in, and I think particularly some other teams within the Pew Research Center in particular, if they're looking at, let's say, the team that studies US politics, they know that every election year, there's certain things that they're going to ask every election year so they can trend in terms of interest in the elections and how people are thinking about the candidates. For us, it's a little bit different. We do have trends and we do look ahead and repeat some of our questions, but it's a little different because we don't have specific questions that we know we're going to ask, let's say every 2 years or every 5 years. And so since you like methodology, I'll also add that we had trends going back several decades. And then about 10 years ago, we shifted our surveys from the phone to the web. And it's been a big change in methodology. The survey research world is really changing. And phone surveys especially became extremely expensive. And calling cell phones, which you have to do, is very expensive. And so a lot of research organizations have moved online, including ours. And so there were several trends that we have lost because of the mode difference, because we know through several studies that we've done that particularly for some types of more sensitive questions or more personal questions, we know that whether you're talking to a live interviewer versus a self-administered web survey, that you answer differently. And so we've had to lose some of our trends. It's been about 10 years since we started our own research survey panel. We now do have trends going back 10 years and will continue going forward. But a lot of our trends that had been decades old, we don't have anymore.
So the topics that I think we're going to talk about today, I'm going to talk about 3 of your research areas. One of them is how Americans view their jobs. One of them is the Great Resignation, why workers say they quit. And the third one is, there's actually a couple more. The COVID-19 pandemic continues to reshape work in America. And about a third of U.S. workers who can work from home now do so all the time. That's a compound sentence. We're going to have to take it apart. Let's start with the big one. The findings that you would summarize from how Americans view their jobs.
So we've been studying work and work life for a very long time. And especially over the last 4 years or so with COVID, we started really looking at how the workplace is changing. We've looked at the Great Resignation. So a lot of the big debates around work we've been looking at. And then about a year ago, we did a survey that looks more broadly at how people are experiencing work. And one of the things that we found is that about half of US workers say that they're highly satisfied with their job. But there's a big difference in terms of the types of things that people, we asked about different aspects of work. And we do find that on the personal side, so in terms of how people are relating to their boss and to their coworkers, people are very satisfied with that. So most US workers said that they were extremely or very satisfied with their relationship with their boss and their relationship with their coworkers. But when it comes to some other important aspects of work, like their pay, their opportunities of promotion, there's high levels of dissatisfaction. And only about a third of US workers say that they were highly satisfied with how much they're paid and with their opportunities for promotion. And what's interesting about that is that in 2022, looking at people who had quit their jobs in 2021, among the top reasons were pay, low pay, and the lack of opportunities for promotion. And those are areas where people right now are not particularly satisfied with their work. And so we did see differences in satisfaction by age. There are other factors there. But it was interesting to see that on the relational side, that people are happy with the people they work with and for. But it's really on the more practical side and on the more what pays the bills. People aren't really that happy with that.
It's very funny. When I saw that headline, most people are pretty happy. I was like, not going to sell a book with that.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because it's an editorial decision, because most people are happy with their relationships with their boss and their relationships with their coworkers. But that finding of 51% of workers saying they're extremely or very satisfied. And you can look at that and say, well, that's half. That's pretty good. But then you can say that means that there's half of workers who are not highly satisfied. And so it's not a clear cut, this is a positive or this is a negative story.
And that raises a central question to this, which is, so I have the data, is it good or is it bad? And so depends on your values, I suppose. But also it depends on what you're going to compare it to. And so you could compare it to a trend and you could say, I don't know if this is good or bad, but it's worse than 2 years ago. Or you could potentially compare it internationally. Do you ever have that opportunity to do international comparisons of your data using similar questions?
Yeah, so we haven't done that on our work surveys, which I think would be really interesting. We have a separate team at Pew, which I actually worked on that team for several years in my earlier days at the Pew Research Center. We have the Global Attitudes team that does research internationally. And so some of their surveys might cover 20 countries, sometimes they might cover 40 countries, and they cover a wide range of topics from foreign policy to gender equality and things like that. We haven't done a comparison on work satisfaction, and I think that would be really, really interesting. We have looked at things like intergenerational relations and how people are helping aging parents and things like that. We have done some international comparisons on that, but I think it can be fascinating to do a survey of how people are experiencing the workplace in different countries. We haven't done that, but you're right. I can't give anything away because these are findings that haven't been released, but we have a survey of teachers that we just did, and we did ask a question about satisfaction. And in that one, we do compare teachers to all workers, and spoiler alert, teachers are less satisfied, but I can't share the numbers right now.
Yeah, I'm related to a lot of teachers. I know that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I know that to be true. I have lots of anecdotal data that's true. Within a data set, you do segmentation of the population and you look for differences in how different groups are reporting. What did you find in terms of those splits of the data and how people are experiencing their jobs?
Within our team, the main lenses that we tend to look at things through are age, gender, socioeconomics. So sometimes we look at income, sometimes we look at education, and race and ethnicity. In this one, in the study of how satisfied people are with their jobs, the one thing that I would say popped the most was age. Older workers were the most satisfied. And of course, there are different possible explanations for that. The 65 plus, maybe the ones that weren't satisfied have retired, and the ones who stayed in the workforce were the ones that were happy with their jobs. But also by the time you were farther along in your career, either you're the boss or you have more autonomy. There are things that come with seniority, and younger workers are the least satisfied. We see that not just in that survey, but when we were looking at some of our COVID and work and how the pandemic was reshaping work life in the early days of the pandemic, that among those who could work from home, younger workers were the least likely to say that they had the resources that they needed at home. Some of them maybe living with roommates, maybe their employer isn't giving them the resources to maybe go buy a printer or whatever it is that they need. And so younger workers often, they don't have control of their schedule and their tasks and things like that. And so they tend to be the least satisfied and the most stressed and overwhelmed, whereas older workers tend to be the most satisfied and the ones that say they're experiencing the least stress and feeling the least overwhelmed.
I'm interested in variation, which is, I'm going to stereotype teenagers, and I apologize. But if I were surveying teenagers, I might expect to find more variation in response. And that's because they're really way up or they're way down. There's just a stronger emotional range. Do you look much at variation within populations? I'm asking that question because I'm curious. But also I'm thinking about the data and how it would show up. It would just show up as really flat, I guess. If there was a lot of variation, you'd see almost the same at one end as on the other. It's a deeper question. I found myself weirdly laughing out loud when I started thinking about the questions that I wanted to ask you. One of the questions was the nature of the people, and this idea that some people are just sort of naturally Eeyores, and some people are sort of naturally SpongeBobs. And I'm one of those. You know what? If I'm flipping patties, I'm happy. And if I'm answering a survey, I'm probably happy, but also, I want you to feel good about yourself. And so I'm going to answer the survey to help you out. Just this idea that there's a baseline to the population, which to some extent is an attribute of the population.
I would say that there might be something to that. Obviously, people are different, and some people might have a more positive outlook in general. But I think that we would see similar responses across these different areas. So, for example, when we're asking about work, so let's say we have a sample of 1,000 people. And if we had half of those where I'm always positive, I'm always happy, and half of those were like, no, I'm kind of disgruntled and I'm going to be contrarian and say I'm unhappy with everything, then we might see that 50-50 split through all of the items that we ask about. But the fact that we see people can express high levels of satisfaction with one aspect of work, but then dissatisfaction with another aspect of work, and maybe they're a little in the middle on something else, I think that suggests that people are able to really evaluate these things for what they are. And one of the things that we know, in part because at the end of every survey, we have an open-ended question where we allow respondents to give their feedback. And most don't, right? Most are just done and they're moving on and they submit their responses and they're done. But people really do express an appreciation for just being allowed to share their experience. And so I don't necessarily think that people are just thinking about what does the researcher want to hear, or I don't want to come across as a negative person. And we saw that during the pandemic, and we saw that in responses that we got to that open-ended question at the end. People really wanted an opportunity to talk about how things were going for them. And especially when we do our surveys, because our surveys tend to be about family and work, and they really are things that are very relatable, maybe a little easier than the surveys from some of our colleagues that are studying policy and politics and things that could be difficult for people, difficult to talk about, but also things that people really have to think about. The answer doesn't come as easily because it's not about their personal life. But people really do appreciate the opportunity, even if it's negative and if it's positive, people really do appreciate the opportunity to share.
And for somebody who's looking at this data and assessing it, it occurred to me that I should have asked this question a long time ago, which is that when I'm looking at any particular topic, is there a high end that I should never expect? What I started thinking about, this is one of the things I laughed about, was the idea that if we were going to take a baseline of things everybody loved, we'd have Labrador puppies. And if we were going to take a baseline of what everybody hated, we'd have sewage. And if we were to ask the question, what is your distance from Labrador puppy? We might have a better answer. Like knowing what the true range is, maybe even with Labrador puppies, you'd still get some variation in response. I don't know. Some people, I hate Labrador puppies. Give me sewage any day. I don't know. But as a specialist in surveys, do you think about that?
I don't think about it in those terms, but I think as you were talking, I mean, like one thing that's interesting is that I think we as survey researchers are so also trained to know that there are always going to be people out there who think differently, right? Like Labrador puppies, there are probably people who don't like dogs and they have no interest in the puppy or whatever. And so we don't assume anything about what people do and don't like or what does and doesn't make people happy. And so even as you were talking, I was like, well, I couldn't say that. I wouldn't assume that in the survey. I'd first have to ask them how much they like Labrador puppies. But I think that very rarely, and I'm trying to think as we're talking, and I can't think of any one question in particular, but it's so rare that we get any questions with close to 100% on one side or another. People are very complex and nuanced, and it's very hard to even think about what would we find agreement on. And again, I'm just trying to think of, there's like going through my head, and I can't think of a survey question that we've asked where we've had close to 100% agreement.
Okay. And a part of the reason I ask is that there might come a point close to Labrador puppy scale where we said, we probably can't get better than that. And it's not 100%, but it's almost at that point it becomes, you just can't compress. So a part of what you've answered is, you're never going to get everybody to agree. It's very unlikely that you're ever going to get everybody to agree. So don't actually strive for a perfect score because there's always going to be variation in rating. And that's an important thing. You can't compress response to perfection.
Yeah. And I would also say that the instinct is to look for the majorities, to look for the big numbers. And if you don't find those big numbers, you think like, oh, like, I'm not sure what this means. I don't know what this says. And I think that 51% finding on 51% of US workers being extremely or very happy with their job is an example of that. We couldn't say a majority are highly satisfied or dissatisfied. And so you have to think of the context. And what does it mean if half are highly satisfied? That means that there are half who aren't. Or, and we did a survey a couple of years ago of K through 12 parents. And, if you find that about a third of parents have concerns or extremely worried about a school shooting happening at their kid's school, well, given the topic, that's a high number. So what is and isn't a high number is also contextual, and it doesn't always have to be a majority. And for some things, unless you see huge numbers, like maybe if you're asking about Labrador puppies and you saw that only 30% like them a lot, you might say, wow, that's low. Like you might expect to see, maybe you're in the 75%, but if you're asking about sewage and 30% said they really like it, well, that's a high number, right?
Right.
So the context matters.
The Great Resignation, very interested in why people say they quit their jobs and how they feel about it now.
In early 2022, everyone was talking about the Great Resignation. We did a survey. It wasn't very long. It was just a small set of questions. But the findings were really interesting. And we'd asked people if they had quit a job in 2021. And then we asked them questions about it. What were the reasons they quit? We didn't ask if they had a job lined up, but we did ask if it was easy or difficult for them to find a job. And the vast majority of them were employed by the time of our survey. And the majority of them said that it was easy for them to find a new job. But what was really interesting was that we then asked people, because as I mentioned before, among the top reasons for quitting a job were low pay and a lack of opportunities for promotion. And so we asked people about their new job, the job that they were presently in at the time of the survey. And we asked if the pay was better, worse, or the same as their last job, and if the opportunities for promotion, if they had more, fewer, or about the same. And the results really were mixed. And there were also big differences by education. And so for workers with a bachelor's degree or more who had quit a job in 2021, most of them said that their current job paid more and had more opportunities for promotion. But for those who didn't have a bachelor's degree, only about half said that they were being paid more and had more opportunities for promotion. The other half were either worse off or no different. So they left the job because of those reasons. But what they found at best was the same, if not worse, for half of them. And so I thought that was really interesting. And I thought that was another place where it's important to look at different groups, in this case, education, also in terms of the reasons people quit. The top ones were similar across educational levels, but for people with lower levels of educational attainment, it was also not getting enough hours. And I think that that's something we saw too, like when we were doing some of our COVID and work research, that everybody wanted to talk about remote work, which is really important. And, when we look at our body of work, it's something that we've paid a lot of attention to because it's a big change. But about 60% of workers don't have teleworkable jobs. And so for most people, they were not working from home and they were not experiencing some of the things that we were writing about and doing research on. And so I think that's important to pay attention to also. And of course, those with higher levels of educational attainment are the most likely to have teleworkable jobs. And so I think when we were looking at the Great Resignation, looking at the experiences of those with the bachelor's degree or more versus those who don't have a 4-year college degree was really important. And the outcomes were different.
Interesting. I've had a hard time interpreting those data when I've heard them in other contexts. And a part of the reason is having 50 million people quit their jobs indicates that somebody is not happy. It's a measure of not liking your job. I've also heard elsewhere that some 40% quit without another job offer in hand. And to me, that sounds like great optimism about the economy and my ability to find something else. So listening to individual points of data, sometimes you have to start to assemble it before you get sense out of it. It's very consistent throughout all of your data that wealthier people, people who are more educated, they're just happier. Either they are happier as people or they are having outcomes at work that they like better.
Yeah, we do see that. We do see that across a lot of our data. And we see that when we look at some of the outcomes, not through the survey data, but through some government data in terms of family arrangements and in terms of wealth and things like that. So yeah, it is something that we see consistently. And that's why we think it's important to look at the data by different groups to really understand the different contexts that people have in their lives. And with the pandemic, and even by 2023, if we were post-pandemic, that even more broadly, even when we weren't asking about COVID in particular, people with lower incomes and Black and Hispanic workers were more likely to say that conditions in their workplace weren't safe. In the context of the pandemic, we were asking specifically about safety in terms of COVID, but even more generally, as we continue to ask about physical safety, not in the context of COVID, that the types of stressors in the workplace are different for different groups. And I think that's really important to talk about.
I agree. There should be a rule of podcasting, never read data, but I'm going to read some data. The reasons for quitting is what I'm looking at. So we've talked about pay is too low, no opportunities for advancement. The third one on the list, which is not that far behind, is felt disrespected at work. And I thought that was really significant. The fourth one is childcare issues, very pandemic related, it seems like, although not necessarily. The fourth one was not enough flexibility to choose when to put in hours. And let me just say, at the very top, pay was too low. That was the major reason 37% of the time. But as we get down to felt disrespected, that's 35% of the major reason for quitting. Then we get down to not enough flexibility. That's 24% of the reason. So the truth is, as we go down the list, the numbers stay reasonably high. Do you know if you could only choose one major reason?
No. So for each of these, we asked if it was a major reason, minor reason, or not a reason why they quit, right? And so you could say that everything was a major reason, or you could say that only one thing was a major reason, everything else was a minor or not a reason.
I should have known that because it adds up to way more than 100%.
Yeah.
But a very large number of people were saying that flexibility in terms of their jobs, and then benefits, and then wanted to relocate. Working too many hours, that's down at 20%, put it as a major reason. Working too few hours was 16%. There's an opportunity for rebalancing there, I think. So I guess it supports to me a thesis that people care about a lot of things.
They do. And I can tell you that flexibility is something that workers really care about. And this goes back for those workers who can work from home. One of the things that we saw during the pandemic was when we asked those who had not worked from home previously and then started working remotely or hybrid after the pandemic, one of the things that people really pointed to was that it helped with their ability to balance their personal life and their work responsibilities. There were things that weren't as positive. People thought that their relationship, their ability to interact and relate to their coworkers suffered when they were remote, but their ability to juggle everything in their personal and their work life had improved. And several years ago, in 2015, we did a survey of paid family and medical leave. And as part of that work, we had asked people about different job benefits that were important to them. And while people did say that things like health insurance and paid leave were important, flexibility was at the top of the list, right? And this is pre-COVID, but flexibility, both in terms of where to work and when to put in their hours, was at the top of people's lists of things that they were looking for and that were important to them. And that's something that we've continued to see through the pandemic in particular. And one of the benefits that people see of telework and hybrid work really is that ability to balance things and to have that flexibility. And so that's something that's really important to people, in terms of the working too many hours, working too few hours. And as I mentioned before, for those with lower levels of educational attainment, working too few hours was a problem, right? It tended to be more of a major reason why they quit, because if you don't work enough hours, you don't make as much money, right? And so these things are relative to what people need. But, the respect one I thought was interesting, because then in the survey that we did a year later, in 2023, where we're asking about workplace satisfaction, we did see that most workers do feel respected at work. So that was interesting, right? But for those who don't feel respected, that's a big thing. It's an important thing. And so it was interesting to see that most people did feel respected at work. They did feel like they could be themselves at work. And I think that speaks to that level of satisfaction with their coworkers and their bosses, right? And so on a personal level, people were expressing satisfaction, even if there were things about their job that they weren't as satisfied with. But I think from that human level, most people do feel respected at work and do feel that closeness with others around them at work.
I think it's very easy, partially because of people like me who are sort of getting mileage off of saying everything's terrible, to know that not everything is terrible. It's nice. It's very relaxing.
Yeah, I'm glad that I can do that for you. But, what I think that speaks to the work that we do, I do think that with so much in the world today, it's either things are really, really bad or things are really, really good, or it's this way or it's that way. And there is nuance, right? You can be happy with some aspects of work and unhappy with some aspects of work. I think about the hybrid work and the telework debate. Either it's going to be the most horrible thing because nobody's ever going to have contact with anybody else and it's going to destroy work life, or everybody should be working from home. And their workers are seeing benefits and they're seeing some downsides. And there's just so much nuance in how people experience most things in life. Most things are not one way or another. And so I think that's part of what we offer, really, is that nuance.
How do you experience how your data are used? And it's sort of related to the question of, how do you wish people used the information? Because I'm projecting a little bit, but I would imagine that sometimes there's a bit of a head slap, no, that's not the interpretation that I would have had.
The way that the Pew Research Center thinks about our core audiences are mostly, and that's changed over the 18 years that I've been there. But currently, we're thinking primarily about the media and the engaged public. And of course, the media is a way to get the information out to the engaged public, right? And of course, policymakers are really important for us too. They get our data through various means. We don't spend as much time as we did at other times, really directly engaging with policymakers necessarily. But we do know that they use our data, and we see it in the way that our communications team is tracking the use of our data, right? And so we really do want people to use our data to make better decisions, right? And to have data that cuts through the noise of the polarization that we're seeing on everything. We see it in our, maybe not so much in our research on work, although yes, when we look at DEI and some other things, we do see the political polarization that we see on all the other topics and several topics too. And so we do want people to take our data and really look at it and make their own decisions. And so we don't tell people what to think or what to do. And, when we were talking early on about the non-advocacy mission, and it's kind of silly, but we call ourselves a fact tank, which is to distinguish ourselves from the think tanks in town, because the think tanks are all making recommendations, which again, there's value in that. But it's not what we do. And so sometimes people will ask me in an interview, people will ask, what should employers do? And it's not my job to tell employers what to do, but I'm providing data for people to look at and to look at what are workers unhappy with? What are they looking for? What are the things that make work easier for people? And then draw their own conclusions based on their workforce and based on their organizations. So what we really hope that people will take from this is both to be able to learn something about other people, maybe see themselves sometimes in the data, but really learn about other people and how they're experiencing things and make good decisions based on that.
That's an interesting point, which is that there's sort of a positionality point to be made, which is that I know where I am on the wealth scale and I know how I'm experiencing work. And I can say, I cannot extend those assumptions to people who are in fundamentally different situations that are not experiencing what I'm experiencing because their context is truly different.
That's right. And if you're somebody's boss, you may need to think about maybe people who are younger and starting out in their career. And that's going to be different from people who are more advanced in their career. And you might need to think about the parents who work for you, who might be juggling certain things. And so there are different things that you might not be able to relate to in your current point where you are in your career, in your life. But to be able to take a step back and say, well, and I think, again, like during the pandemic, to be able to say, okay, here's how people are experiencing telework, but not everybody can work from home. And so here are the people who are feeling physically unsafe at work and feel that their employers aren't keeping them safe, right? And so to be able to understand the perspective of those people is important, whether you're their boss or their coworker or just somebody who's just interested in other people and how they live.
I want to unpack that one headline that you just barely touched upon just now. About a third of U.S. workers who can work from home now do so all the time. Okay, so let's take that apart. So 60% can't work from home. 40%, I think you said, can. Of that 40%, one third do so 100% of the time.
Right. So to just make sure everybody's clear, when we say can and can't, it's not that whether they're allowed or not allowed to. It's about whether or not we ask people if most of the responsibilities of their job can be done from home. So there are people who might say yes to that, and they're in this group, in this universe of people that we're looking at, but they may still not be allowed to. Their employer might not allow them to. So the can and can't is really based on the responsibilities of the job and whether the job is teleworkable, not whether they personally are allowed to telework. So of those who have teleworkable jobs, about a third, and this is a survey that we did about a year ago, about a third were working from home all of the time. And while that was down somewhat from a year before, hybrid work remained very popular. And so when we've asked people how often they worked from home before the pandemic, the vast majority, so about 2/3 of workers say they never worked from home. Of those who have teleworkable jobs, never worked from home before COVID. And now that's only 12%, right? So these changes have really stuck, right? And they've changed over the course of the pandemic, of course. And when we did a survey in October 2020, most people with teleworkable jobs were working from home all or most of the time. And so people have gone back to the workplace, but it's very rare now that people are 100% in person, which before the pandemic was the case for most people were in person all of the time.
Yeah, that's a really good clarification, especially because there's a population in this headline which feel that they could do all of their job at home, but they may not. They are not permitted to. And so there's that slice in there. And expect them to show up in future why workers say they quit their jobs. That particular population. There's a question I always ask at the end, which is, what do you hire your job to do for you?
I've been thinking about it a lot, actually. And because I've been in my job for 18 years, I've been thinking about how that's changed and how what I hired my job to do for me 18 years ago may not be the same as now. And when I first came to Pew, I would say coming out of a PhD program where most of my friends were going academia, and I knew I didn't want to do that. But this job allowed me the opportunity to do very relevant research with clear real world implications, but also in a very rigorous way. It allowed me to remain a social scientist without being an academic, which coming out of an academic program, sometimes there are questions about that and there are doubts about that. But as the years have gone on, this job gives me an opportunity to understand the world and to make sense of the world and to help others make sense of the world. And so I would say that's really what I would say I hired my job to do for me, which is to give me the tools and the resources to help people make sense of a changing world and like a polarized world, and to really bring some fact and some impartiality to all of that. But I think I'm going to keep thinking about this because it is such an interesting question. And yeah, it's given me a lot to think about.
Just to say that that line of research and that question it's very different from the kind of research that you do, which is that I'm looking for, it's first of all, it's qualitative. And so I've been collecting qualitative data, if I can call them data. And then the second thing is it's looking for diversity, which is I've never quite heard, partially because I've never talked to somebody who had a job quite like yours, which is I hire my job to be a sense maker for a nation. That's a new answer. I'm going to put it on the list as a new answer, right? Because it's the differences that I'm most interested in. What does your job cost you?
Well, I would say that one of the things that my job cost me is the opportunity to make recommendations. We are all people with opinions, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't have my own opinions on things, and I do. And this job requires a lot of discipline. And it's hard at first. It can be really hard at first. And then it becomes second nature, and then it becomes very easy. And you learn how to really just rely on the data and to understand how important it is to be able to do that. Right. But what this job cost me is that opportunity to say what I think should be done and to make those recommendations, which I see the value in not doing that.
It would be very hard to be a trusted sense maker if people felt you had an opinion. In fact, this is a routine answer to cost, which is that cost is very often opportunity cost, which is I don't get all of the features I want in my job or I might like in my job because they're mutually exclusive.
Yeah. But I think what you learn in a job like mine is that because again, we're all humans and we do have opinions and we do come from certain backgrounds and we do have certain experiences. And we really learn to understand our own blind spots and to make sure that we correct for that. One example is when we study work, everybody at the Pew Research Center works in an office. We have teleworkable jobs. We experienced the pandemic very differently from people who didn't have those types of jobs and who felt unsafe going into work. And being able to see that and being able to see the value in asking those questions. And when we did the survey a year ago on how Americans feel about their job, we pre-tested the questions because we wanted to make sure that the questions that we were asking didn't only apply to people that had jobs like ours, right? Or we're asking about DEI in the workplace, that we didn't just ask people who are maybe in the types of jobs that might have a DEI person or counsel or whatever it is. And wanting to make sure that those questions made sense to people or people who didn't work 5 days a week, 9 to 5, that maybe they had different types of schedules. And so being able to understand your blind spots and seek out perspectives as you're putting together your research, seek out perspectives that are different to make sure that those then are represented in your data and in your questionnaires. It's something that my job has given me, and it's a skill that I've learned and become better at over the years.
Where can people learn more about you and your work?
All of our work is available at pewresearch.org. We have all of our reports. We also have data sets that people can download. So for people who do statistics and can download raw data sets and do their own analysis, It's all available free of charge. Again, we're a nonprofit. This is all in the public interest. It's all available there. And you can find me there also. And I'm also on LinkedIn, Juliana Horowitz. You can find me on LinkedIn. And you can find me in the staff directory at pewresearch.org.
And I think, if I remember correctly, you can go into Pew and you can look at the research and you can search on Juliana. And I think that you get all your research.
That's right. Yes, you can search on any researcher and look at their publications. You can search by team, like if you want to look at what our science and society team is doing, you can do that. And yeah, you can search by topic area. There's something for everybody. We have 8 different research teams covering different aspects, from religion and public life to technology and news and information and social and demographic trends and everything in between.
Thank you very much for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much. This was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio, for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.